It is now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker of the morning and also welcome her back to Chicago. Una Osili is Director of Research at the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University. She has served as a member of several national and international advisory groups, including the Social Science Research Council, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Development Program. In addition to her appointment at the Center on Philanthropy, Dr. Osili serves as Associate Professor of Economics and Philanthropic Studies at Indiana University-Purdue University, Indianapolis. In 2007, she was a visiting Associate Professor at Economics at Yale University. She is a consultant with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and has worked for the World Bank. She also serves on the Research Committee of the Association for Research in Nonprofit and Voluntary Organizations and the Board of the African Finance and Economics Association. Dr. Osili is a prolific researcher with an extensive body of published research. She earned her BA in economics at Harvard University and her MA and PhD in economics from Northwestern University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Una Osili.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've really enjoyed talking with all of you. Thank you to Jamie. She's done such a great job organizing this conference. I actually had to ask her when I met her, can you tell me a little bit about your career path? Because she paid attention to every single detail surrounding this trip. So thank you. Just wanted to start by sharing with you a little bit about how I got interested in studying migration. And since I'm back here in Chicago, I chose to focus on a project that I worked on several years ago. Actually, it was part of my doctoral dissertation. And I think it's fair to say that migration is literally transforming a lot of our communities, our country, and the world. Nearly 10% of the world's population is an international migrant, meaning they live outside the country of their birth. And a statistic that I absolutely find very interesting is that when we look at second-generation households, that's another gauge, 20% of the US population has at least one parent that's foreign-born. So many of your students are second generation, maybe 1.5s, as you heard earlier. And a classroom exercise that I do quite often whenever I talk about migration, even in my college class, is I ask the students, how many of you were born outside the US? And I try to see how does that match up with the national statistics. Then I ask them, what about parents? How many of you have parents that was, or at least one parent that was born outside the US? And then you could even go back to grandparents. So maybe their parents were all born in the US, but do you have a grandparent that was born outside the US? And starting to talk about those migration stories provides very rich context for the material that we'll be covering today. So let me give you a quick outline of the talk. I'm going to start by just giving you some general background. What you heard earlier was a lot about the impact of migration on the host country, the host economy, the host city in the case of Chicago. What we don't hear as much about within the context of the literature on migration is the impact on the home country, where these migrants came from in the first place. And as a student, I found that really intriguing. I was very fortunate to take Joe Ferry's class. Joe Ferry is a professor at Northwestern, but he studied here at University of Chicago he was one of Bob Fogle's students. So many of you have read Time on the Cross, know Bob Fogle's work. Joe Ferry did some really interesting work matching ship records. So when immigrants arrived in the US in 1910, he found them in the ship records and then tracked them to the census 10, 20, 30 years later, and was able to track occupational mobility, where people started and where they ended up. Fascinating work. Now, he told me, do not try to replicate my work. It's really difficult. He had to spend years in the archives, manually transcribing ship records and matching them with census data. Just as an example of the type of research that's being done in migration, very pioneering work. However, there's still a missing piece. We know how people do here in the US. We know very little about what happened to their families back home, their communities, and the countries they left behind. What was the impact of that migration? So that's where I started my research, actually, was trying to understand the impacts on the home country. As I mentioned, really not as much known. The migration narrative in the US is really a one-directional portrait. Immigrants come here, they stay, they achieve success or not, and that's the end of the narrative. We don't know very much about people who return back to their home countries, and we know even less about the impact of that move on those families and communities. So I'd like to share a little bit about what we've been able to learn, and in my work, what I have been most able to contribute to this literature around the ties that bind, the ties that connect immigrants to their home communities, the places that they come from. And I'll start by presenting some data from a project I'm working on currently using the New Immigrant Survey. The New Immigrant Survey is a project that was started in 2003. Mark Rosenzweig, who's a migration scholar, is one of the principal investigators, as well as Doug Massey at Princeton is another migration scholar that is tracking this data. It's really new data because what they use is a sample of newly naturalized immigrants, legalized immigrants. When they become green card holders, they are part of this survey. And so we're able to learn a lot about these new immigrants that are coming to the US and are becoming legal permanent residents. So I'll show you some data from that. And then I'll ask you to come sort of on a journey with me, the same journey I took, which was basically trying to find migrants' families. I started with a sample here in Chicago, and I tracked their families and their communities back in their home country. So I was able to see literally the two sides of the migrant experience, the experience here in the host country as well as the experience in the home country. And I'll also talk more broadly about the challenges for researchers and policymakers as they try to kind of weigh this literature and understand the impact of migration on these two sides of the Atlantic in some cases, or the Pacific, as the case may be. So let's get started. A little bit about the motivation for thinking about home country impacts. When I first started studying this, it wasn't, okay, might have to pause for a second. Excellent. I hope everything's okay on the University of Chicago campus. All right, one way to think about this with a lot of your students in terms of motivation is migrants come here, they earn incomes, they spend some of that money perhaps, so the spend, I know a lot of you know this from my son is a fifth grade student, so I know a few years back he had to make this bank that was a spend, share, and save bank. And my husband's an architect, so it was a huge undertaking for the whole family. And he did end up winning, I think, the second or the third prize in the school for the complexity of the project. So this idea of spending, sharing, and saving is really intriguing when you take it to the migrant context, because the notion of a household itself is transformed. So in economics, the standard definition of a household is people who are living together under one roof, and in a developing country it would be cooking using the same pot would be added as a definition of a household. Now we think about households today and it's very difficult because they're blended families, they're kids who live in multiple locations, but think about a migrant family as an even more complex notion of what a household or a family really means. Because migrants have families that are really spread across many locations, across countries, in some cases, across continents. So migration truly extends the definition of a household. So you might live in Chicago, but your brother lives in the Philippines, or your father and mother live in Guatemala, or in Mexico, as the case may be. Many different, and when I think about my own family, I really understand what it means to be a transnational family, because I have two siblings in Lagos, Nigeria. One, my brother lives in Zurich, and my sister in Chicago, in the suburbs, and I'm in Indianapolis. My parents both live in Nigeria, so it's literally a transnational experience. In the same vein, migration also extends the notion of community. So when we think about community, it is usually a geographically bound place. But increasingly, we have transnational communities that span national and international boundaries. Why is this so important to mention? Because when we think about migrants, we know that they are interacting economically with individuals that live all over the world in some cases, really complex to look at. But one piece of evidence that we can use to study the size of these interactions is really one concept, remittances. And this is where I have done a lot of work in terms of understanding what these resources look like. When I first started studying remittances, they weren't really well tracked. So I'm sort of giving away my age here. It wasn't well documented. Today, remittances have become they're now hailed as the new development finance. Why? Remittances have outpaced foreign investment to many countries, not all. But they're growing faster in some cases than foreign direct investment. They're also growing faster than aid. And they're much larger than official development assistance to many countries. So when you look at a lot of countries in the world today, developing countries, remittances are number 1 or 2 in terms of foreign exchange earnings. Certainly that's true for Mexico, that's true for Nigeria, that's true for the Philippines. It's hard to pick a large country, and there may be a few, where remittances are not a factor in either foreign exchange earnings, when they compare to official development assistance or to foreign direct investment. Another issue that is quite interesting, in the past, migration was mostly male. So it was mostly men that migrated and perhaps left their families behind and sent money back to those people. Today, a lot of the migrants may be female. That's also changing dynamics as far as who controls what. I'll give you an example. The Philippines, a lot of the migrants tend to be female. They work perhaps as nurses in other professions around the world, in the Middle East, for example. And many of them leave their husbands behind and children behind in the Philippines. Just one migration story. How does that change relationships back in the Philippines? There's a lot of work being examined in that area. Does that lead to greater empowerment for women? How does that, what is the impact on children? Same thing for Mexico. You now have some female migrants from Mexico coming, leaving their families behind. So there are so many things to look at. It's hard to really know where to start. And I'll just start by sharing some of the overall numbers so you can see this in context. The yellow line it might help to actually use this. The yellow line is foreign direct investment. And not surprisingly, it does seem like the largest flow. But what you notice about foreign direct investment, during the financial crisis, it declined significantly. It basically plummeted when the financial crisis hit. Now let's take a look at the second line. That is, the red line is recorded remittances. This is money that migrants send back to their home countries. This is money that families throughout the developed world send back to poor countries in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. I just want to note here that what's quite unique about remittances is that they tend to be more counter-cyclical, more robust to economic change. In other words, during the downturn, we didn't see remittances disappear. They stayed relatively robust compared to foreign direct investment. And let's look at the last line. This is official development assistance. This is what we call aid, foreign aid. And what I'd like to point out is that this is actually quite low. This is something that might be interesting to your students. We tend to think of foreign aid as this huge, big kahuna, big elephant in the room, but compared to foreign direct investment and recorded remittances, it's a smaller sized flow. Remittances are almost $300 billion to the developing world, and in contrast, official development assistance is more like $50 billion. So magnitudes are significantly different. You may also wonder about other types of flows, debt, and so forth, and that's also extremely, you can see during the downturn, the recent economic crisis, that also basically fell quite significantly. I want to just note here that we call this recorded remittances. Does anyone know why we're calling them recorded remittances rather than just remittances? Yes?
Because they can be tracked, whereas in many cases there's remittances that are taken by somebody to another country, totally off the radar.
Exactly. So recorded remittances essentially are transfers that migrants send through official channels. So if I go to Western Union or to a bank, that would show up in the official records. It would show up in the balance of payments, in the bank statements, in the IMF statistics. But there's also money that is simply not on the books. what we call pocket transfers. Economists call pocket transfers, money that people just put in their pockets when they go. How did I know this was so important? As a graduate student, I was traveling to Nigeria for Christmas, and a family, a distant relative called and said, could I take $5,000, or I think it was $5,000, which was a lot of money, certainly back then, still is, to Nigeria. And I said, that's a lot of money. What would happen if it got lost for some reason? And he said, I trust you. I think you'll be fine. But that was the most nerve-wracking trip I've ever taken in my life, because I just thought I certainly don't have the money to replace it if something happened. So that's a pocket transfer. That will never show up on any balance of payments, any government record. There's also another type of transfer that some of you may have heard of, the Hawala system. That became very commonplace during at least a household term during 9/11. Does anyone know what the Hawala system is? Has anyone heard that word before? Yes.
I can't really remember exactly how it works, but it's the Islamic system that somehow gets around the prohibition on interest, taking interest. I don't remember the details.
Okay, well, at least it's linked to the Middle East. You're correct there. Yes.
Basically, is you make a payment here, somebody in the other country transfers the money. So really it's a whole network of dealers, I would say.
Very good. That's exactly right. So the Hawala system is a Middle Eastern term, but it's used in every country probably. I was really surprised to see how often it was used in the Nigerian context. What happens essentially is Jamie and I know each other. I'm going to Nigeria. She wants to get some money to her mother in Nigeria, just as an example. So what happens? I can basically say, Jamie, you give me the money here, and my parents will give your mother the money back in Nigeria. So the money actually never crosses international borders. It's based on trust. I give her she gives me the money, my parents will then compensate her folks. And that works, it's very informal, but it also is a lot of money changing hands that way. And during 9/11, we became aware of how important these informal exchanges were and how significant they were. So there is actually a lot of scrutiny placed on domestic transfers now. So if I transferred $20,000, the bank would add to Jamie, they would ask me a lot of questions. Why are you transferring this money? What is it going to be used for? That is only really after 9/11. So that's another way to bring this to your students and incorporate it into lesson plans, is just to think about exchanges that take place within families, formal versus informal. Yes, Jamie?
I don't know if this is the right time to ask, but
Yes.
what about using cell phones to transfer money? Does that become more common?
Yes, so that's also, the past 15 years have been just a leapfrog in innovation. When I was conducting my thesis research, there was no Western Union in Nigeria, if you can believe that. The only way to get money back home was pocket transfers or this Hawala system, and maybe bank transfers, but that was very complicated and expensive. And your family would not get the right amount because only the official exchange rate could be used. So another way to bring this into your families, to your students, is to talk about exchange rates and changing money, because it's not a simple transaction. Today, you can send money in your office on Western Union's website. You can transfer money electronically through your banks. Nigeria is no longer on the, I think it's terrorism watch list, so you're now allowed to send money through banks. But mobile phones are becoming very important as well. So this is just the big picture. Now let's get into the actual research questions that we're going to deal with. Did you have a quick question?
Just the thing that sometimes families can become money speculators by just either transferring the money or waiting until the Nigerian pound goes up or down, or wherever the dollar is down or gains down. So that also is something to consider.
Right, so I think one thing to, I think I just pressed the wrong button here. I was warned about this. Let's see. Okay, good. All right. Now, as I mentioned, there's sort of two projects I'm going to be sharing with you. One project is using the new Immigrant Survey, and that's ongoing work. The other project is completed work, which uses original data that I collected here in Chicago and also Nigeria. What I'd like to show you is data from the new Immigrant Survey. And this is a question that was asked to the sample. Did you send a transfer to your family in the past year? That was the question that was asked. And what I'd like to point out here is that there's a significant variation in the fraction of immigrants that actually report sending a transfer. Let's take Africa. Africa actually has the highest response. In other words, 20% of the new immigrant sample that was born in Africa said they sent transfers to their family. In contrast, less than 10% of European migrants did. So remittances are widespread, but they also vary across country of origin. They vary by the type of migrant, and they vary by the characteristics of the origin family. So if my family is really wealthy, I may not need to send them money. Whereas if my family's poor, I will have to send them money. I may be bound to send them money. And the country of origin environment also matters, as we can see. With poorer countries, if you come from a poor region, you're more likely to send a remittance, as you can see here. And it's really interesting, the poorest continents, of course, are Africa and Asia, and those have statistically the highest fraction of immigrants that are sending money back home. So this is where we started from. What we found really interesting in this project is to understand the variation in migrant characteristics, home family characteristics, and country of origin characteristics. In particular, we found that if your family was less educated, poorer, and so forth, you were more likely to send a transfer. And if you came from a country that had more unstable conditions, it was more difficult to send money, you were also less likely to send a remittance. So those are some of the issues that we looked at in that project. I'm working on this with one of our graduate students, so it's still work in progress, but I thought it would be interesting to provide the broad context. What I'd like to say, though, here is that in the new immigrant survey, you're looking at a very select type of immigrant, often a very highly skilled immigrant, someone who came here with an H-1B visa, a skilled worker, very different from the work that we heard about earlier with hotel workers and so forth. So we're going to expect a lot of difference in the highly skilled population. These are mostly doctors, lawyers, and scientists. Many of them come from more of an elite background. They tend to be highly selected, is one way to think about them. Positively selected. Okay. Quick summary, some other findings. One of the things I've tried to do is sort of pull out some of the intriguing messages that come out of this new immigrant survey. One issue that's quite interesting is the role of gender. That we do find that female migrants tend to be more likely to remit, holding other variables constant. They're more likely to send money back to their families. And this is really something that is quite interesting in the developing world, because for a long time, at least the stereotype is invest in your sons because they'll take care of you when you're old. And what a lot of families in the developing world are finding is it's their daughters that are sending them money when they leave, and their daughters that are taking care of them. So it's changing patterns of how families invest. So this is sort of a subtle impact of migration on gender back home, that it may be changing patterns of gender inequality or equality. This is what some of the research in this area is showing, and I just worked on an anthology, remittance literature anthology sponsored by the Social Science Research Council, where we really looked at this female effect, not just the effect on female migrants here, but on conditions back home. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. The other note from the new immigrant survey is that beyond remittances, migrants are engaged in their home communities in a lot of different ways. So you might think of their ties as being broadly economic, but also social, very strong social ties. Many migrants visit home frequently. They call their families. Skype is a huge help to a lot of immigrant families because they can maintain contact, and mobile phones play a big role in it. So in the past, if you look at migration 100 years ago in the previous century, it may have been more difficult to maintain the type of ties that you maintain today with your family back home. Today, migrants perhaps have the opportunity to truly live transnational lives. And I also want to be clear here, migrants to some extent have always lived transnational lives to some degree. If we look at narratives in the turn of the century or the previous century, Italian immigrants, many of them crossed the ocean multiple times. The birds of passage that the previous speaker referred to could also be written about that particular wave of migration. What is different in this context is the idea that you can actually get on a plane and be somewhere in 6-7 hours in another continent in a poor part of the world. You can pick up the phone at any time of the night and call. When I first came to the US, I had to spend literally an hour or two dialing my parents in Nigeria, if you can believe it, just to get through because the lines were so difficult. So I'd have to block out maybe 2 hours just to keep dialing until I got through. Today with mobile phones, it's much easier to call. There's email, there's Skype, and so forth. So this is something else that can be incorporated into your lesson plans. How do migrants maintain connections with their home communities? The other interesting feature that is probably not a surprise to many of you in this room is that migrants can maintain ties with their home community while they're here in Chicago, because there are hometown associations, there are all sorts of events, picnics, festivals, and anthropologists have probably done a much better job of documenting the nature and the extent of these transnational ties. The third point that I'd like to make is that beyond remittances, migrants can also contribute to their home countries by their human capital. And by this, I mean one of the areas is actually migrants engaging in volunteer work in their home countries, forming organizations here that benefit those home communities. A few studies that are being done kind of point to this phenomena. We are at the Center on Philanthropy at IU. One of the things that we're doing is actually tracking the growth of these diaspora organizations. And it's not just for Africa, for Asia, for Latin America. There has been a huge increase in the formation of nonprofits that are formed by immigrants to benefit causes in the home country. In addition, international giving, and this is another side statistic to note, is one of the fastest growing subsectors in the US today. So charitable giving is one of my other hats in addition to economics. And one of the things we found by tracking giving over the past 10 or 15 years is that the international subsector is growing at double-digit rates. So last year grew at 15%, with more US households giving internationally. Immigrants are certainly playing an important role in that as well. All right, so we've looked at the big picture. We're now going to switch gears and really look at a micro case study, and that's the case of Nigeria. As I mentioned, as a graduate student, I actually carried money back to Nigeria and wondered what the volume of these flows were. At the time, there was no national data to look at. It simply wasn't being tracked. Today, it is being tracked, and Nigeria is the only country in sub-Saharan Africa to rank among the top 25 remittance receiving countries. It also accounts for 60% of all the recorded remittance flows to Nigeria. Some other statistics: remittances are the second largest source of foreign exchange earnings in Nigeria after oil, and outstrip foreign direct investment. This is a shock to me as an economist, because you think of Nigeria, it's an oil-rich country, Shell, a lot of BP, Exxon, those are the names that come to mind. So I was quite surprised to see, and these are recorded flows. So we're not talking about the informal flows. If we added those in, some estimates suggest that about half of all remittances take place through informal channels. So that number would increase quite significantly. So Nigeria is a really interesting case because it's an oil-producing country, and it's gone through a lot of economic and political upheaval. In the 1970s, it enjoyed the oil boom, and with that, a lot of economic migrants came to Nigeria. So Nigeria had immigrants actually arriving in the country from the Middle East, from Eastern Europe, and from other African countries. Well, fast forward the tape to the 1990s, the experience was quite different. Nigerians were leaving the country, especially the highly skilled portion of the population. And the debate was really not about how much can we absorb in terms of foreign workers, but the discussion was around brain drain. That was sort of the two-word phenomena that we heard a lot about. Okay. Now, one of the things I'd like to pose is, as we hear, how many of you have heard this term brain drain before? Is it something that's pretty widespread? Well, right now, there's also another debate taking place within the academy, and I think also within policy-making circles, around brain gain. The idea that migrants can be part of development in their home communities through their remittances, through their advocacy, through their volunteer work, and even perhaps through their return migration. In other words, they can come, spend time in a developed country, gain substantial skills, and then return and reinvest those. So it's no longer this one directional flow of resources and talent, but it can be a circular flow of resources, talent, and experience. Okay. One of the challenges to really get into this big debate, brain drain on one hand, brain gain on another hand, is how do you actually start doing that? Because in terms of measurement, it's really hard to actually figure out what the net impact of migration will be. An idea, potentially, is to look at remittance flows and measure those. But even that is problematic because remittances are a broad category. My goal as I started out my doctoral research was literally to unpack the concept of remittances, to take this black box called money that migrants send home and look at what actually is made up, what is actually part of that money that migrants send back. I started with field work here in Chicago. I talked to a lot of migrant families, went to a lot of migrant association meetings, visited a lot of venues, and then did one-on-one interviews with migrants. And that's where I saw that the notion of remittances was actually much more complex than scholars had initially recognized, at least at that time. There are at least 3 distinct types of transfers that migrants were sending. The first category is perhaps what's best known. It's money that migrants are sending to their families. I'm going to call that, just for simplicity, private transfers. Money that someone here is sending to their family back in Nigeria. And that generally supports the living expenses of the family, helps with educational expenses, health expenses, financial expenses. It also helps the family in terms of insurance. If they have a bad outcome, they lose a job, bad health, high hospital bills, the migrant plays a key role in sending that money back. The second type of resource transfers, I'm just going to call them savings, because what migrants are doing is actually investing in their home countries. They're buying stock, they're buying land, they're buying houses, they're building houses. It's hard to think of those as also money to help your family, because those are really designed to be part of a migrant's portfolio. They're saving here in the US and they're saving in another country. Why are they saving across locations? Well, think about it. The idea of a migrant family is now extended across space, and so it's not surprising that their savings and their investment would be essentially distributed across locations for several reasons. The singular reason, perhaps, is portfolio diversification, because shocks are not perfectly correlated across countries, so it makes sense to diversify your risk. There's also a lot of other reasons. Migrants may have very good information about opportunities in other countries that the rest of us may not. And then finally, community-based transfers. So think about it. Many of us give back in many different ways. Teachers in particular, I almost think every day you wake up and you're giving back. So maybe you are exempt from this giving back discussion. But for everybody else, there's always a discussion around how much should I give? How much should I keep for myself? How much should I give? Migrants face this because they have causes here in the US that they support, as well as causes in their home country. So when they make decisions about philanthropy, they're making decisions across geographical space as well. And so migrants are spending money in their home countries to support projects, whether it's hospitals, water projects, schools, erosion control, all sorts of other projects. And I'm going to group those under community transfers. In Mexico, these are quite significant. There's actually a matching program called, well, there was Tres por Uno, which is 3 for 1. For every $1 that the Migrant Association sends, the government matches that with $3, and it's now been increased to a 4-for-1 match. So each dollar the Migrant Association raises gets a $4 match from the Mexican government. So community-based transfers are increasingly important in the context of the developing world. Okay, now within the theoretical literature, scholars have often asked, are these transfers that migrants are sending, are they altruistic? In other words, are migrants just doing this out of the goodness of their heart to benefit their families, to benefit their communities, or is there a self-interested motive there? And this is something economists care a lot about, altruism versus self-interest. And to the rest of, I think the rest of the academy, they're often puzzled. Why do economists care whether it's altruistic or self-interested? Does it really matter? Isn't it a combination of both motives? In other words, when you give money, aren't you getting something back too? Can you really divide it into those two classes? And we're going to come back to this debate because what I'd like to share with you is that some of these transfers do appear more altruistic. In other words, I'm doing it to benefit someone else, while some appear to be more self-interested. This primarily benefits myself as well as my family. All right, now to share some data with you, I think this presentation would not be complete without showing you some of the numbers. What I'd like to share with you, first of all, is for the Chicago sample, 90% reported sending a transfer to their origin family. So the first stage of the sample was I actually surveyed a random sample of Nigerian migrants in Chicago. How did I find Nigerian migrants? I used, back then, it was a paper phone book, but it was on CD in the library. So I was able to select a random sample of Nigerian names focusing on the southeastern part of the country, so distinctly Igbo names. And I called these migrants up and I scheduled an interview. I actually went to their houses. I got a lot of great meals out of this. And as you know, as a graduate student, you always enjoy good food. And I always put this point in because this was my dissertation committee loved this. I also got a few marriage proposals, which I had to turn down. All right, and then the second stage of the survey was going back to Nigeria and interviewing the families of these migrants. So I was able to track if the migrants said they sent money, did their family actually say they got money from the migrants? So there's a sort of a check built into the survey design. It was very different doing these interviews in Nigeria because here in the US, if I said I'm a Northwestern student, I'm collecting this for my dissertation, most people, I would say only 2 people refused participation in the survey. When I went to Nigeria and I tried that same line, I'm a graduate student working on my dissertation, people looked at me with sort of blank stares. That did not work at all. So I had to try a different tactic, and I talked to my parents about this because they're both university professors, and they know a little bit about field work in Nigeria. And my dad sat me down, he said, don't say anything about dissertation, just focus on, I talked with your family member in Chicago. I'd like to talk to you about the money that you've received and what you're doing with it. So make it focused on the personal link, make it personal, in other words. It just shows you doing research across continents can be very challenging, but also extremely rewarding. The fact that I had talked to their family member in Chicago was often a door opener. They were very excited to see me. They had questions for me. And in that sense, the survey design worked quite well. But what I started out with in terms of talking about my educational background and what I was doing with the research was not a door opener at all. So if you're ever doing this type of research, I think it's really important to, and for your students, to understand the context in which you're doing it. One of the things I'd like to point out is that a lot of migrants are sending money to their families, so about 85%, but actually quite a significant number are sending money towards investments. So 35% said, I sent money in the past year to support an investment project. You may ask, what types of investments are these? Most of them are houses. Migrants are building houses in their home countries. Is this so unusual? It turns out it's not. I was just in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, in May, and there's a whole section of Jerusalem, beautiful houses and apartments, vacant. The only people that live there are cats, apparently, because the migrants who bought those houses and apartments live anywhere in the world and come back maybe every 2-3 years to Jerusalem. The houses remain vacant. Same thing is true in Amman, Jordan, in all over the Middle East and in Latin America as well. What I found quite interesting is that this was true in the Italian migration experience in the previous century. So something to keep in mind. These are not that new, perhaps, but they are new in the way that migrants are going about them because of the role of technology in particular. In terms of dollar amounts, the total transfer, the average transfer was about $6,000. About $3,000 went to the family, and about $2,000 was sent for investment purposes. And so when you think about the sharing component of your resources, $5,000 goes to your family, and about $300 goes to these community projects. In contrast, about $3,000 is saved in the origin country environment. What I'd like to point out is that the numbers actually match up. If the family said, the migrant said they sent about $3,000, this was quite close to what the family said they received. So there wasn't a huge discrepancy in these transfers. All right. Now, in terms of the big picture, one of the things I'd like to just establish as a takeaway from this survey is that remittances are a very significant part of the migration experience. So this idea that migrants come here and they simply forget about their families back home, simply not borne out by the data, not the new Immigrant Survey for the highly skilled migrants, and not from this survey that perhaps captures a broader range of migrants, from the less skilled to the more skilled migrants, that really these economic ties are quite significant. About 90% send regular transfers or send at least one transfer to their family, and about another 40% roughly send investment-related transfers. What I'd also like to point out is that gender is a significant factor in explaining the incidence of transfers as well as the levels and the types of remittances that are being sent. That's something I'd like to perhaps come back to, hopefully, if we have some time. Thank you very much. Okay. So some additional findings. Women are more likely to send remittances. They're more likely to be remitters. But if we look at the origin family environment, female-headed households are also more likely to be recipients of the remittances, and they tend to receive larger dollar amounts. It's also interesting to note that female migrants are more likely to target their transfers towards health, education, and youth-related projects. So there's also a role in terms of how the remittances are used in the origin country environment. Another key finding from the work is in the investment domain. One of our key findings is that migrants are more likely to actually be investing in housing above all the other classes of investments. This says something about the origin country environment as well. It may simply be that this is a less risky investment compared to investing in the stock market in Nigeria or other types of investments. But we do find what's interesting about this is that it is actually migrants who are richer, who have higher income, that are more likely to invest in housing. But it's also true that less skilled migrants are the ones that are investing in housing. So if you can picture this story, a migrant here in the US, in Chicago, may be living in a rented apartment, a one-bedroom apartment, but they have a huge house back in Nigeria. Why are they allocating their resources that way? The way to think about it is really, there are many different reasons, and I'm sure that I hope I can get to some of the theories that are developed around housing investments. The key thing is that the policy environment also matters. Housing may simply be the most stable way to invest your resources in a developing country. The house is there for a long time. It's durable. It's a fixed investment, just like many people start with housing and then perhaps move up the investment ladder. The other piece of evidence that comes out of the migration survey is the role of these community transfers. A lot of descriptive evidence from many different sources suggests that migrants maintain ties not just with their families, but also directly with their communities of origin. And in the literature, especially around African urban-rural migration, migrants maintain ties with their hometowns. They invest in projects in their hometowns. They raise money for scholarships, for building roads, hospitals, and other amenities. What's unique about what's happening now is that migrants are taking a lot of the concepts around philanthropy in the US and applying it to their home country. So there's sort of a hybrid model that's developing. And it's especially interesting here in Chicago because my older sister last year, her group raised $100,000. It was a Nigerian women's group. And at the end of it, the goal was to raise money to send back to Nigeria, but there was a lot of disagreement about where that money should go, which village should get it, which community should get it. So in the end, they donated it to the Chicago Children's Hospital because that was something everyone had some buy-in. So another way to look at this is that this is not unproblematic in many contexts. When migrants come together, they have different allegiances, and this can affect how the philanthropy is, decisions around philanthropy are made. Another surprising finding around community transfers, if you remember, I had posed this dilemma: are these transfers purely altruistic, or do they have a self-interested component? That was a test that we were able to implement in this context because migrants come from a range of villages. Some of them are really poor, remote villages, and others are actually very urban, very well developed. So the theory that I was able to test here is, are migrants sending money to the least developed, poorest, most remote villages that really need those resources, or are they investing their philanthropic dollars in more established, wealthier communities? Now, I'd like to just, I know you probably know the answer, but let's take a quick poll in the audience and see, what do you think the results were? Do you think migrants were investing in the poorest villages or in the richest villages? How many say the poorest? Okay, the results are up there, but what would be your prior? My prior was really that these migrants wanted to improve conditions, so I thought the poorest villages would be getting the transfers. It was actually the more developed villages with better institutions, with better conditions. So that was a bit, I think, certainly didn't support the model of altruism. It supported more of an idea of self-interest. They were investing in communities that were already quite rich to begin with. But that's not too surprising if we think about philanthropy even here in the US. The colleges that get the most money are often the richest universities, not the least well-off universities. And it's also important to note that the richest villages are also the ones that have the better institutions. So there's sort of a third omitted variable here. And it's those institutions that organize migrants and organize the solicitation of funds, the gathering of funds, and the spending of those funds in communities. In the poorest villages, the institutions are weak, and often the migrant associations are non-existent. So that's something to keep in mind. There's a third factor, the role of institutions in mediating these community-level transfers. All right. Yes. Right, so you would think that regardless of whether you come from a poor or rich village, you would have a personal connection to your community of origin. But there's a third factor, which is the role of the institutional environment. Someone actually has to ask you for the money and solicit the money. And in the poorest villages, there's sort of a critical mass issue. There may not be enough migrants to really organize and facilitate that collection and transfer of the resources. Although one of the most, I think, hopeful visions that emerged from my research is this ability to see both sides of a family, both sides of a community, a migrant's life here in the US, as well as their lives back in their country and community of origin. What was really interesting was to see these migrant projects at work. That was something I hadn't expected. I didn't really have a lot of well-developed hypotheses around, but I saw these on-the-ground projects, erosion control, libraries that were being built. In one village, the school roof had collapsed completely, and migrants had sent money to actually fix the roof on the village school. And the appeal was very personal. The idea was, you went to this school, you benefited from this school, let's rebuild it for the next generation of students. What makes that very different from the official development assistance paradigm is that migrants are investing their own resources for the betterment of their communities. In many cases, they know the challenges of those communities very well. They understand the barriers and the institutions, and it also cuts out the role of the middleman. There's no overhead necessarily to raise the money. It occurs quite efficiently, and migrants are donating their time to actually supervise a lot of these projects. So that's the very hopeful message emerging from this migration survey. But beyond just the money that's being spent, one thing to keep in mind is that countries also have another way to engage their diasporas beyond money, but also how to engage their talents and their skills. So we hear a lot about countries that are losing their highest skilled migrants, whether they're doctors, nurses, scientists, but there are ways to engage the diaspora once they leave. The key concerns that I looked at as I saw these migrant organizations and the work they did is essentially one of scale. Many of them are operating as very small scale entities, and to have a larger impact, they need to grow. The challenge is, of course, as they grow, they need more organizational support. The other question that comes up quite frequently whenever I present this work is one around leverage. Can the migrant associations partner with other groups that are doing work in these communities? Can they collaborate with larger entities like the World Bank, the UN, some of these multilateral institutions? And how sustainable are these operations? So they can do a one-time project like a village school repair, but can they sustain multi-year projects every year that actually will have a long-term impact on a community rather than a one-off? We heard a lot around the Haitian earthquake that Haitian communities actually played a significant role. Haitian doctors, nurses went back to help many communities here raised funds. It's easier perhaps to facilitate that type of one-time shock, but the ongoing support of the communities in Haiti, even though the earthquake is over, those communities are still in need, but there isn't necessarily a mechanism to sustain the longer-term needs of communities. In terms of, I'll just wrap up here, in terms of the role that the country of origin can play, the biggest issue is, what is the environment like? Can migrants easily send money back? Are there barriers to their transfers? And what types of technologies are available if you want to send money to your family versus an investment-related transfer versus a community-level transfer? What are the institutions that would need to be available? What is the cost of sending that money? How confident are migrants? Do they have trust in the organizations and so forth? So there are a wealth of sort of theoretical as well as very practical concerns that have to be considered. And then finally, I wanted to share with you some pictures from my field work. The first one is just to show you, while I was in the field, Western Union actually opened up in Nigeria, and they did this by partnering with the oldest bank in Nigeria, First Bank. It was actually a collaboration, and if you read that very carefully, it says, now you don't have to wait endlessly for money that may never come. So this was a big innovation, to be able to go to Western Union or to a bank and actually collect the money and not have to worry that the money might be lost, it might never get there, your friend may just misuse it or lose it, and so forth. And so this is a really interesting partnership because Western Union studied the Nigerian landscape and determined that it wouldn't make sense for them to just go in as a solo venture. They would need a partnership. And so can some of this actually work on the institutions, the migrant institutions? Is partnership one model that they could follow? I also wanted to share with you some of the pictures. I actually took some pictures of the houses that migrants were building just to give you a flavor for what these look like. And you can see they're not small houses, and they're often built in very remote environments. So it's very easy to spot a migrant house from just a regular house. The migrant houses are huge. Usually they're mansions, quite large. And what's surprising is that some of these migrants who have these big houses in the villages in Nigeria have apartments here in Chicago. So they're making decisions about how they're allocating their resources across locations. Why build a huge house in a village when you're not living there? That's the question I'd like all of you to think about. It may seem from an economic perspective that that is inefficient. If you're building the house because you want to return, you just wait until you're ready to return and then build the house. So it poses a challenge to a standard investment model that you would think about for housing. However, if you think that the house provides other benefits, non-economic benefits to your family, to your community, and that it is an insurance policy in case you ever want to go back, it may make sense to build the house earlier rather than later. So it's the social benefits that migrants derive from these investments that are important to consider as well. This is a hotel, actually, that's being built by a migrant in one of the villages. The other reason to think about why migrants build houses is that there isn't a rental market in many villages. There isn't a hotel industry in many villages. So if you show up in the village and you don't have a house, you really don't have a place to stay. And this is also something to think about. My dissertation was actually called Migrants and Housing Investments. So I spent literally more time than anyone wants to imagine thinking about the motivations for housing, particularly, and why this was such an important investment for migrants. So I'm happy to talk about that more. And I'd just like to wrap up by thinking about what some of the new questions are in this research about migrants. I would say gender is perhaps one of the least studied questions. How do female migrants differ from their male counterparts? Male migrants have been studied more extensively. Female migrants are just beginning to be studied. And we know that the economic benefits to families can be quite significant. As I mentioned, it's the poorest families that receive these transfers, but it's also the poorest families that are least likely to have remittances, to have migrants in the first place. When women migrate, they appear to invest differently, to spend their money differently, and to support their families in very different ways from male migrants. So gender affects not just the level of transfers, but also the impact that it has on the origin household. And it's also very interesting in the community transfers that female migrants are thinking about very different priorities when they send money to their families, with a focus more on health and education for younger family members. So I'd like to just stop here and open it up to questions. Hopefully we can get into some of these other issues. Yes. Yeah.
Do you have any statistics about, I know it would vary by social class and job, et cetera, but the general percentage of income that migrants are typically sending?
Right, that's a hard statistic to get at. Let me repeat the question. Her general question was, what share of a migrant's income is remitted to the home family? The data that I'll point to is a data set that I'm working with right now. It's the Panel Study of Income Dynamics of American Families. It's a 40-year-old panel, but in 1997, a refresher sample of immigrants was added. So that has about 500 immigrants, newly arrived, post-1965 immigrants, and also a sample of native-born, so you can compare the two. And what's clear is that immigrants are more likely to send private transfers to family members, not just abroad, but even within the US. And the average level of the private transfer is also higher. It tends to be about 10% of household income. That's about the statistic for immigrant families, 10% or so. When we look at private philanthropy, just as a contrast, it's about 2% of household income that's shared. So if we go back to that earn, save, share, and spend model, how much of your income do you save? How much do you spend? How much do you share, whether it's with other family members or with people that you don't know at all? In terms of helping others. So that may be one way to bring this question of remittances or migration to a very sort of micro level to each student, is to think about how you share your resources. It's very interesting. In the PSID, we also have something called a child development supplement that looks at children in immigrant families. And there we actually don't see any statistical differences in sharing between children of immigrants and other kids. They're sort of statistically insignificantly different from one another. But the second generation households are more likely to give private transfers. and tend to give larger levels. So this idea of the extended family is very important when we look at migrant families.
The second part of that is that do those levels differ by social class or wealth?
So a lot of the statistics that I've just pointed out are regressions control for income and control for wealth, and we do something quite unique because of the panel nature of the data. We can control for a household's permanent income, so their income in the last 5 years. We can actually average that. And private transfers are statistically different for immigrants. That's the way I have looked at it. Controlling for income, immigrants are more likely to send money to family members, and they give more level-wise. Yes, controlling for income. So this is, comparing them to their native-born counterparts. Okay. Just for immigrant households. In this data, for example, one of the things we do see is that it is important to control for the family circumstance. So, in other words, if your family's poor, then you're more likely to send money to them. So the really important factor is not just the migrant's income, but also their extended family circumstance. And that's what really makes that's what's important. In the PSID, we can control for that. So I'm an economist. I tend to think of holding other variables constant. And many of you are used to thinking about, well, we want to look within socioeconomic class. So I can probably do that comparison, but that's not what we've really emphasized in the study. More the apples to apples comparison. Did you still have a question? You had your hand up. Yes. Very good question. This sort of says not all decisions are economic decisions. There's a sort of psychological decision to purchasing, and or investment decisions are not purely economic. In the case of housing, there's both an economic motive as well as a sort of more, I would say, psychological motive. In the case of the economy, in the 1990s, the Nigerian currency was devalued significantly, so depreciated, which meant you had a one-time opportunity to really send your dollars back and really get a huge return. So a lot of migrants took advantage of that. The purchasing power of the dollar was quite significant. So that's the economic reason. On the sort of more psychological set of factors, where is home? This is something that migrants are probably confronted with. All of us have this question that we all wrestle with. When I came to the US at age 15, my mother told me, you'll never really have a place that you'll call home again because you've left home at such an early age, you'll never have a real home. And I told her a couple of years ago that she's right. I don't really have one place that I call home anymore, but the nice thing about it is that I'm at home everywhere. That was my way of looking at it. But I think migrants do face this tension. Where will I retire? Where will I go? Will I stay in the US forever? What if I lose my job and I'm forced to go back? Or there's a family circumstance that forces me to go back. Will I have a place to live? So the house could be an insurance policy of sorts, so that if you ever go back, you have a place to live. So I do think that there are a lot of motives, and it's hard to disentangle, but certainly both the economic and the psychological motives are important. Let's see. Yes, go ahead, and then we'll take that question.
In terms of gender, is there, if you know any of that, is Nigeria unique?
Very good. So his question was about the role of gender in household decision-making around remittances. And essentially, economists have this theory of bargaining within the household, where husbands and wives bargain over how much should go to the wife's family, how much should go to the husband's family. And remittances bring this to the forefront because the migrant family has needs here in the US that they have to take care of. Now they have two sets of families back home that are demanding resources. And how do they prioritize? Unfortunately, my sample size is relatively small, so it's hard to kind of completely unpack this issue. But what I did find more, I would say, a broad empirical result is that where the woman had more education, contributed more financially, she also had a more decisive role in how their resources were allocated back home. So in other words, Amartya Sen, one of my professors, used to say it was the perception of productivity that mattered in these bargaining decisions, and where a woman brought a lot to the table, and this is in quotes because we know that in all families, all members often contribute, but it's the perception of productivity that often drives that, as well as you have to think about the needs of the home family. So if there's really an emergency, then that would have to supersede. So it's the balancing of the wife's bargaining power within the context of the household, as well as controlling for the origin, family, circumstances, and environment. I think those are the factors that would play a role. Yes. Very good. So this was a question of whether you could break it down by social class. In my paper, which I think I have that on the website in terms of resources, I actually classified migrants into two groups, skilled and unskilled, so just a simple divide based on their occupation, not on their education, because many of these migrants had a bachelor's degree or higher, but in terms of the jobs they had here in Chicago, they ranged from taxi drivers to doctors. There was a whole spread of skill levels. So I used that as a proxy for socioeconomic status. And what the interesting finding for the investments is that it's actually less skilled migrants who are likely to be investing in property and investments back home. So that suggests sort of a return migration motive, that they're less likely to stay here in the US, so they're really building up assets for the event of return migration. Whereas the skilled migrants are investing in both locations in many cases. The unskilled migrants tended to be investing more in the home country. So when you see the cab drivers in Chicago, and maybe you feel sorry for some of them because they have a PhD and they're driving a cab, don't feel too sorry for them. They might have a very nice house in Nigeria. Yes.
What percentage were, I guess to use a politically correct term, documented and undocumented in your survey, if any were undocumented?
Okay, in the survey, I did ask about legal status, and I would say about 80 to 90% of them were documented, so it was probably about 10% that were undocumented. In the new immigrant survey, all those individuals are documented. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of other data sets to look at this issue because the census doesn't collect data on remittances. The American Community Survey doesn't as well. So a lot of our US surveys have very limited information to track these flows. Most of our data collection exercises have focused more on activities of migrants here and not very much about the ties they have with their origin countries. You had a question as well. So her question was, what do we know about these informal transfers that migrants send? In the case of Nigeria, when I started this project, Western Union was not around. So informal was really the only method. There wasn't necessarily a formal alternative. So I did study a range of options that migrants had. One option in particular that's worth noting is the hometown association. Many of these hometown associations have websites. So you can go and post on their blog and say, I need to send money to my family. Is anybody going back? And then they would respond to you. My dissertation committee thought that was just the best story, that technology was playing a role in connecting these migrants. So I could want to send money. There's a migrant in Canada that's going back, and I simply wire the money to them, and it looks like I'm sending money to Canada. I'm really not. That person is then taking that money and taking it back to my family. So I did observe a lot of that mediated by the hometown institution, the hometown associations. Yes. Right. I think that's why there's been so much interest in remittances. They've been hailed, as I said earlier, as the new development finance. So rather than official development assistance, can we just send more money through migrant associations and through migrants themselves? There's some cautionary notes in this. The reason that this is so successful is that it's a person-to-person transfer. It's a person-to-community transfer. And the minute you try to build more infrastructure around it, you may lose some of what makes it flexible, what the trust that is embedded in those personal networks and relationships. So I certainly find a lot of opportunity in remittances that are not currently even tapped into. For example, the 4-for-1, 3-for-1 programs, as well as some of the bond financing that's backed by remittances, loans that are banked by, there are all sorts of financial products that can be developed. But I also want to caution that what makes them so unique is the very flexibility and informal nature of these flows. I think we probably have to, yes.
But I just wanted to quickly mention that taking us a bit outside of your research, would it be appropriate to also call the remittances within country having to
Yes.
that has a large effect also? And I know I come back to the cell phone thing, but I haven't been able to find many articles on it, and I'm
Yes.
so interested in how these sending coins or sending money
Yes.
with cell phones within a country
Yeah.
means that maybe a person within a household doesn't have to come home every week to bring
Yeah.
money, and they're able to stay in
Right.
another part of the country.
Yes.
And I know that brings up
No, it's a great question. And actually, maybe one other resource I can point the group to is the World Bank has a huge project on migration. And in the last few years, they focused on what's called South-South migration. So it's migration within developing countries as well as across developing countries, say from Mexico to Guatemala or Nigeria to Ghana. And with those lower distance, shorter distance migration flows, there's even more interest in how do you make it easy to send money, because at this point, it's easier and cheaper for me to send money to, say, London than it is if I'm in Nigeria to send money to Ghana. It's just more difficult. You have to go through more hoops. So there's a lot of interest in actually improving the regulatory environment so that it is easier to do these mobile phone transactions and so forth. So I can share some resources on that for the group in case that's something that's of interest. Right. All right.